Hello YouTube and welcome back to my top 5 gaming series. Today we're going to be looking at games which had very poor releases and looked certain to fail, but thanks to the hard work of the devs and marketing teams, they were able to turn the games around and make them very successful. I've defined their success both in terms of the game itself and the franchise they represent, which is an important point to note and will become clear why later on in the video. As always, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button below, but without further ado, let's get into it. Coming in at number 5 we have Star Wars Battlefront 2. Developed by DICE and released by EA in November 2017, the game famously received widespread criticism for its decision to implement a loot box system. This system allowed players to obtain huge gameplay advantages if they put real money into the game. The only alternative to this was of course a very grindy system, which meant that it would take an almost impossible amount of time to play all your favourite characters. Something which any Star Wars game should seek to allow since it's such a fundamental part of the story and the excitement that is held by the fanbase. Now, most people are aware of just how bad this launch was, and led games being sold in stores at a massively discounted price. But my favourite, and I'm sure a lot of people's favourite memory of the game's release, was the fact that EA's marketing backfired so much that it became the most downvoted comment of all time on Reddit with a whopping score of minus 668,000. A truly phenomenal achievement for the community team. After this comment went viral and amidst further uproar from players, EA backtracked on their decision and decided to temporarily remove microtransactions from the game. However, just as the game was starting to recover, EA announced in January 2018 that microtransactions would be returning, which soured the already fractured relationship with fans. Luckily for fans, the return of microtransactions were purely cosmetic and allowed players to customise characters using in-game currency as opposed to the loot crate system, and these cosmetics had no effect on the gameplay. Since its release, the game has received numerous regular content updates, including additional story missions in the solo campaign and the amazingly entertaining Ewok Hunt. These additions go alongside players exploring new planets and new character releases. The game has come a long way since 2017 and is now a massively entertaining game with many different game modes. The most popular modes to note are Supremacy, which is a domination style game, and Galactic Assault, where it's attack versus defense with objectives that keep getting pushed back if the attackers are successful. I also have to mention the popular Hero vs Villains game mode, which is a small sided match where you play as your favourite Jedis or Siths and battle it out for control of the galaxy. The game itself wasn't a travesty at launch. In fact, apart from it being a little bit buggy like seemingly all game launches these days, it was a pretty fun experience. The main issue was the marketing and the loot box system, which led to players becoming bored. Thanks to EA's reversal on the loot crate system and the numerous brilliant updates, the game has gone on to become a huge hit with fans. The outpouring of sadness on social media when it was recently announced that DICE had implemented their final update is testament just to how far this game has come. The game is still going to be looked after to prevent bugs causing any gameplay issues, but players can no longer expect any new content. It is currently unclear if there will be a Battlefront 3, but going from EA being certain to lose their Disney contract to fans hoping that they stay is a clear sign of just how much this game turned it around from its launch date. Coming in at number 4 in our top 5 game recoveries, we have No Man's Sky. No Man's Sky was shot into the limelight after its trailer at E3 in 2014, with several critics saying that it stole the show. The game eventually launched in 2016 on PS4 and Windows, but unfortunately the game had a subpar launch to say the least. Although some critics lauded the technical achievements of a game which is so vast, so unique, and at times so beautiful, the overriding feel to the game is that it had so much potential that had sadly gone unmined. The game was dull, repetitive, and had little to do in terms of crafting upgrades and combat. Fans felt especially let down with the game missing several features that had been promised in it. In particular, the lack of multiplayer options to play with friends. To summarise the game in its launch state, IGN gave it a 6 out of 10 quoting, "No Man's Sky reaches for the stars but falls short by light years. It's amazingly big but too often poorly designed." The game was seen by some as a marketing disaster, and this didn't get much better in the months after the launch as the developers, Hello Games, decided to keep communication to a minimum in the next few months, which arguably made things a hell of a lot worse. Many believed that would be the end of the story, and were about to close the book on another Cinderella story of an indie developer not quite making the most of a great opportunity. However, as to be expected in a game featuring top 5 game recoveries, that wasn't the case. Hello Games weren't ready to give up on their beloved game, and much to their credit ended up with one of the best game revivals in recent history. Hello Games has continued to improve and expand on No Man's Sky to achieve what many expected the game to be on release and much more. The game has received 10 major content updates to include additional features such as multiplayer, an extended story and survival mode. The updates also provided new features such as surface vehicles, base building and space fleet management. Base building is especially a really fun addition and allows you and now your friends to build your home away from home. It can be as complex as you want it to be, so if you're anything like me, then that won't be very complex at all. But looking at YouTube, some of the bases are insane and this feature definitely gives you the creativity that players want and need. No Man's Sky is ultimately an exploration survival game which allows players to explore a near infinite amount of planets. The players can roam the planet collecting resources for crafting upgrades, and they will also need to defend themselves against hostile creatures which may not be too happy with you mining their resources. The resources themselves can be used to craft the upgrades to their exosuit and spacecraft amongst other things. You will also have to be wary whilst in space, as players may be attacked by pirates seeking their cargo or by alien factions whom they have a poor reputation with thanks to the space fleet management feature. The game is still being updated frequently, with the most recent update being in April allowing players to jump into an exosuit and roam around the planets. The game was released in 2016, but is still being well looked after in 2020 and for the foreseeable future. Hello Games deserves all the credit that is getting for this turnaround, and I can't wait to see what happens in the future. Coming up in the middle of the pack we have Destiny 2, which was launched in September 2017 as a sequel to the popular Destiny. At launch, fans criticised the game and many even suggested that the game had taken a step back from its predecessor. It was felt that Bungie had come under increasing pressure from Activision to put out a sequel to Destiny whilst it was so popular, and this led to the release of a game that wasn't quite ready. I'm sure you're starting to see a common theme in this series. At launch, it felt like there wasn't much to do. Activities didn't offer many rewards, and the rewards you did get felt repetitive since every gun had static perks. Some of the criticism from the player base resonated with the actual combat mechanics of the game. This stemmed from what many believed was a reduction in the variety of weapons that a player could use at any one time. In Destiny 1, you were able to have 3 classes of weapons: primary, which was your standard shooters, secondary, which was long-range snipers, shotguns, etc., and heavy, which held options such as rocket launchers and swords. This meant that at any one time a player could have a lot of variation as to how they wanted to approach a fight. However, in Destiny 2 there were only 2 primary slots, one containing elements and one without. There was then an additional final slot for heavy weapons. The elements didn't really feel significant enough to matter, and all the interesting weapons such as snipers and swords were grouped into one slot. The end result of these changes meant that combat was nowhere near as interesting as the original. Once again, this game was launched with microtransactions, which was an additional reason as to why fans were so angry with the game. This could perhaps be seen as the start of the eventual meltdown that we saw with Battlefront 2, which was released a short time later. It should be noted that the microtransactions were only available for cosmetics, as opposed to pay to win, but it still drew in a fair amount of complaints due to the fact that many believed as a looter shooter, cosmetics are an integral part of the game, and therefore the introduction of Eververse was ruining a large part of the game. Safe to say this divided the community. Within months of its release, Destiny 2 began shedding its player base, which was far faster than the original game. Many believed that although DLC was still expected, the game would be unable to recover, and this belief was extended when Bungie and Activision eventually split in January 2019. Luckily for fans, this was not the case, and Bungie went on to make some big improvements to Destiny 2. In September 2019, Bungie decided to make the base game free to play. This was a brilliant idea from the company as it gave the game renewed exposure by making headlines in the gaming community. It also massively increased the player base, both by bringing in old players who had forgotten about this series and new players who wanted to explore what it was all about. Every update now brings additional content, and the criticism of the game from launch no longer exists. Although the base game was still quite short by today's standards, it gives the player a good idea if they'll enjoy the game with the opportunity to purchase DLCs should they want to. Bungie implemented a ton of quality of life changes, which now allows the game to incorporate solid gun mechanics and combat gameplay. Every gun feels unique and different, ranging from how it looks to how it sounds. Updates are likely to be maintained for quite some time, since Bungie recently announced the game will be going on to next-gen consoles. To summarise Destiny 2, Bungie had previously been criticised for not listening to its player base, and even going as far to go in the opposite direction. The relationship with fans has improved massively in recent times, and it feels really good as a player to know that the people actually making the game you play are listening to fan feedback. Coming in at number 2 in our list we have The Division, which was released in March 2016 and received very mixed reviews to say the least. Some players felt that the core mechanics of the game were good, including the gunplay and RPG aspects. However, the overriding feel was that it was another game full of potential which didn't quite reach up to the heights that it could have. When it came out, it sorely lacked in visuals and the gameplay was not up to par with what had previously been shown to fans, not to mention the complete lack of activities in such a sprawling landscape such as New York. PC World summarised the game as a disappointing RPG shooter hybrid full of tedious bullet sponge enemies, boring missions, stale loot drops and a world that felt lifeless and unresponsive. Safe to say, they were not fans. Although they did raise a very good point. When you are emptying a clip into an enemy's skull, you do kind of expect them to fall down, but that wasn't always the case. Many of the game's player base didn't stick around to play in the Dark Zone, which was a major part of the endgame. The general idea of the game was good, but as with any loot or shooter, the game ultimately relies on what you do after you complete the campaign as you grind your way through to unlock new weapons. This is ultimately where the Division failed, and although Ubisoft worked hard to release content to keep players interested, it felt like they were fighting a losing battle. That was, of course, until the release of Survival in late 2016. Survival is the second paid content expansion of the Division and provided a new game mode that offered both PvE and PvP. The game mode sees the player stranded in the middle of Manhattan after their helicopter crashes during a terrible snowstorm. The player is left with no gear, no supplies, no comms, and an infection in their system that threatens to kill them within the hour. Despite all these difficulties, players need to recover a set of antivirals and seek extraction. Whilst on this mission, they must also battle against the elements by finding clothes and equipment as they fight for survival against NPCs. In the PvP mode, you are in the Dark Zone against other agents, as you are both the hunter and the hunted as you fight your way to extraction. It is almost like a small-scale battle royale game which has become increasingly popular in recent years. The difference in survival compared to other, more standard battle royale games was the introduction of survival mechanics. These included cold, hunger, thirst, and disease. You needed to monitor these vital life signs and ensure you looked after yourself by taking medicine, eating food and keeping warm whilst you carry out your mission against 23 other players. Ubisoft continued with adding new content to the game, and this led to several new expansions such as The Last Stand and Resistance. These were both very popular with fans, and all these expansions allowed Ubisoft to turn this game and this franchise around. This of course led to the release of The Division 2, which carried on in the same vein as The Division's progress and had very healthy game sales and reviews, even if they weren't quite in line with what Ubisoft was aiming for in terms of profitability. And now moving on to our final game in the list, we have Final Fantasy XIV: A Realm Reborn. Now the original Final Fantasy XIV game was released in September 2010 to an extremely negative reaction from both fans and critics. The game managed to obtain a measly score of just 48 on Metacritic, and considering its predecessor was rated 83 on Metacritic, this shows just how far the game had fell and how poor the release was. The game suffered major instability from unstable servers causing up to 400 crashes per day. For the lucky ones that actually got into the game, they soon realised that they were actually not that lucky. Many felt that there was a lack of content and a fairly minimal story for a franchise well known for its complex plots. Surprisingly, the graphics of the game were actually pretty good, and the game received some praise for the concepts behind the levelling system that the game utilised. Unfortunately, these positives couldn't paper over the cracks of a game with many issues, such as a convoluted interface, bugs, glitches, and a slow, monotonous story. The developers of the game, Square Enix, were hopeful that they would be able to patch the game to bring it in line with player expectations. However, it became clear to the team that they would be unable to fully mend the game in its existing form, as its engine and server structure were already critically flawed. And that is the end of Final Fantasy XIV and top 5 game recoveries. Only joking of course, as that wouldn't really fit into the series. What this actually meant was that in order to save Final Fantasy XIV, the entire game needed to be rebuilt from the ground up. The company decided to proceed with a reboot of the game instead of a whole new title in order to regain player trust, which they felt would not be possible if they simply scrapped the title. And luckily for them, they were right. For the reboot, they appointed Naoki Yoshida as their director and producer, and he believed that there were 3 major reasons for the original's demise. Firstly, the team had an unhealthy obsession with graphical quality. So much so, he provided a screenshot of a flower pot outside of an inn which contained over 1,000 polygons and 150 lines of shader code. Now, I have no idea what that means, but he also said it took up as many resources as would be needed for their characters. genius move there, developers. Secondly, Yoshida believed that there was a lack of MMO knowledge and experience amongst the game's developers. I don't really believe this since they are an MMO franchise with so many previous iterations of the game, but he cited MMOs are so time intensive to create, so not many Japanese teams make them. And finally, Yoshida believed that Square Enix had the mindset that every problem could be patched. The game had major flaws in its design from the start, but they believed that once it was up and running, they would be able to figure out a solution within that framework one way or another. This of course was not the case. So I think it's clear to see that Final Fantasy XIV wasn't what it was meant to be. So I think that's enough for the negatives for now, and let's talk about the reboot. The game was released worldwide in August 2013 and received great feedback. Critics praised the game for its solid mechanics and progression, with many congratulating Yoshida for the work him and his team did to turn this project around. The game did a really good job of learning from similar type games and trying to pull the best bits from each one. Final Fantasy XIV managed to encapsulate all these genre styles while keeping the quality level high. The combat system is extremely mobile and fluid, which gives you an entertaining style of gameplay for the player. The combat is fairly standard in terms of MMORPG games, including tab targeting, a few hotbars and automatically delivered standard attacks. However, the variety in the combat comes from the introduction of a brilliant class system that the game uses. Each class fulfills a certain role in combat. Tanks soak damage, healers top up team HP, and DPS whittle down enemy HP. Nothing earth-shattering there, but each class is associated with whatever weapon they have equipped. If you switch out your weapon for something new, you will switch classes. The way classes work gives some really unique feeling character builds, whilst also giving the game huge replay value, which is why it's been so popular for so long. This, to go along with a brilliant story and a relatively non-toxic community, allowed Square Enix to regain some of their reputation in the series. This is shown in the recent popularity of the release of the Final Fantasy VII Remake. At one point it seemed that all may be lost for Final Fantasy, but this reboot soon put an end to those thoughts and why it tops my top 5 game recoveries. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to hit that like and subscribe button, but also let me know in the comments, what was your favourite game recovery?